Welcome to the How to Program with Java podcast, where all you need is the desire to learn, and you too can become a Java programmer with absolutely no knowledge of programming. And now, your host, Trevor Page.
Hello. Welcome back to the How to Program with Java podcast. We're all the way up to episode number 22 now. And as always, I'm going to fire off the show with a handful of 5-star reviews. Last week, we only had the one come in, and I sort of said jokingly that I expected 3 to come in this week, and that is exactly what we got. So that's awesome. Thanks very much, guys. First one comes in from someone by the name of Texas Scott from the United States. Texas Scott, gotta love it. He comes in, says 5 stars, says this is top-notch, great content, and your delivery is excellent. And he even gives a suggestion. He says, just a suggestion, as you get further into the discussion, you might want to address interview questions to help all these new Java programmers land jobs. Absolutely, Scott, that's such a good idea. It's sort of been circling in the back of my head. But once someone actually, comes out and suggests it, it's going to happen for sure. Such a great idea. Thank you for voicing that. If anyone else has any suggestions, by all means, feel free to, bring them forward. I'll do like a whole show or maybe even a series of shows around different interview questions and how to answer them. I think that's just such a great idea. Audio certainly is a good platform for answering those questions. So yes, 1,000 thank you, Scott. Fantastic stuff. Second review came in from Russia. It says Roman Shatov. Hopefully, I'm probably butchering that. I apologize. 5 stars. He says, great podcast. In plain English, thank you for your valuable input into the Java world. You're very welcome, sir. I'm much obliged. And the third review comes in with another 5-star, and this is also from Russia, from SK9100 is their username, and it is in Russian. I tried to do a Google Translate on it, and I'm sure Google Translate butchered it because there's no real context behind what it is that it translated the words into. So unfortunately, I can't tell you guys what it was that they said, but they did give me 5 stars, so that's fantastic. Okay, so let's start off episode number 22 with a little introduction to what it is that we're going to talk about. I mentioned last week when I was talking so passionately about unit testing and how I had my adventure with creating the Texas Hold'em poker game. I mentioned that we're going to be talking about mocking and that I wanted to talk about it in this episode. So I figured, hey, why not just roll with the punches and let's talk about mocking today. Now, this episode is going to be very similar to the last in that I didn't do a whole bunch of prep work at all. I've just been sort of, mulling over in my mind what it is that I want to talk about with respect to mocking. So let's see how it goes, and let's see where it goes. Okay, so mocking. What is it, and why do you even need to know about it? Well, like I mentioned in last week's episode, I said when you're doing unit testing, you want to make sure that what it is you're testing doesn't have any sort of interference with it. So if you're testing a specific part of some code, more specifically, if you're testing a particular method inside of a class, like let's say you want to test... with respect to the poker game that I created, let's say you want to test a certain detection of a hand. So, like, if you want to detect if a given, set of 7 cards, if you can make a 3 of a kind with any of those 7 cards. Let's say you just want to test that one method that says, check for 3 of a kind, okay? And you're passed in some cards. When does mocking come into play? Well, when you're testing that one method, if that method, the check and see if you have a 3 of a kind, if that method talks to any other classes or any other even methods potentially, and you want to make sure that those are called dependencies. You want to make sure that the dependency doesn't get in the way of what it is that you're testing. Because remember, the whole point of unit testing is to test one piece of a unit. Okay, the unit means something small, and generally, like I said, just one method, or even sometimes it can just be a part of a method. Although that's more difficult to do. Now, mocking. What is this mocking? Well, mocking is what we can use to help us eliminate the dependencies. Okay? So let's put this into more perspective. Let's put it into a real-world scenario. What sort of dependencies would we have in our method for checking if we have a 3 of a kind? Well, what I can think of off the top of my head is this. What if we had our method, which is to check and see if we have 3 of a kind, but there's nothing being passed into that particular method? Okay? So if there's nothing being passed in, we would most likely have to go out to grab the cards that are in play here. So let's say inside of our check for 3 of a kind method, there's another method call, perhaps to a whole nother class, that says, get 7 cards. Okay, let's make it simple. Let's keep it simple. Get 7 cards. And what that get method does is it will go and, let's say, look at a deck of cards and pull 7 cards off of the top of the deck. Perhaps, that method will also reshuffle the deck if it runs out of cards or something like that. Who knows what that particular method can do. But the whole point of it is to get 7 cards. So it gets the 7 cards and then gives it to our check for 3 of a kind method, which is what we want to test. Now, let's say, for instance, that there could be a potential for errors inside of our get 7 card method. Okay, because if you're getting 7 cards, what possible things could go wrong? Perhaps you could have an index, array index out of bounds exception because you are, trying to get 7 cards, but there's only 5 left on the deck. Let's see, perhaps you get some sort of concurrent modification exception because maybe, you're looping through this deck of cards and somehow you remove something when you shouldn't have. Who knows, right? There's a whole plethora of things that could go wrong inside of another method. And you don't want that to interfere with the unit that you are currently testing, which is the check for 3 of a kind. So does that seem to make sense to you guys? If you're trying to test a method that should check and see if you have 3 of a kind, you don't want it to be throwing errors about how it couldn't get 7 cards. Okay? Getting the 7 cards is a dependency, and we don't care about that dependency. We want to get rid of it. Okay? So that is where mocking comes into play. All right? So how does mocking work? Well, what mocking does is it allows you to mock up a version of a class. Okay? So let's say that there's a deck object. Okay, it's a deck class, just like a deck of cards, and that deck object has the method get 7 cards. Okay, or maybe deal 7 cards or something like that. We can actually use this concept of mocking to create something like a shell of that object. Okay, so what it does is it goes in. And we can actually type in our code and our unit test. We want to say, okay, I want to essentially instantiate a deck object, but I want to mock it up. Okay, so I'm instantiating a shell of that particular object. So what it will do is it essentially will cause, if there's any methods that return anything that gets returned, it just automatically makes it essentially null, depending on obviously what the type of variable it is. It will, change anything, like if there's a void method, then it actually won't even execute anything inside of that void method. It just skips it essentially. These are the basic concepts behind what a mocked object will do. Okay, that's how it will behave. It behaves in such a way that it's a stripped down version of itself. so that if you do call a method, there's nothing that can go wrong. Okay, if it's a void method, nothing happens. It just doesn't do anything. If it's a method that returns something, then it just returns null, and it doesn't actually execute any code. Okay, Java can do this by utilizing some pretty cool technologies. It actually mostly relies on something called reflection, and even so much as bytecode rewrites. So it actually goes into what it is that your class gets compiled into and sort of tweaks it a little bit. So it's really cool stuff. It's quite an advanced topic, so I don't really want to go into that. But the result is that you get yourself an object which essentially is never going to throw an error. It's never going to throw an exception. There shouldn't ever be anything that goes wrong with that object. Okay? So basically then what happens is you can create, let's say you create a mock object of your deck class. So you actually instantiate a real variable. Okay, it's a real variable that you can use and refer to and invoke and all these things. And that object or that variable will represent or point to this shell of the deck class. Okay, so it's a real object actually in memory, but if you try to invoke you say deck dot get 7 cards, it will just return null. Okay, it doesn't actually try to execute any actual code that's actually written inside of that class file for getting 7 cards. It just immediately says, okay, return null. All right. So, okay, well, you might say to yourself, how is that useful then? Because if you're actually, running a unit test, if you're actually running a test on the, check for 3 of a kind, then you need those 7 cards. You need 7 random cards to see, or maybe not random cards, but some sort of 7 cards, whether they're random or whether they are for your choosing. You need those cards to be able to, use the actual logic of checking to see if you have 3 of a kind or not. Okay? So then, how is that mocking is useful? Well, that's only one part of a very large, useful framework that mocking provides. You can actually do something where you tell Java what it is that you want to have happen in certain cases. So, in other words, if the get 7 cards method is called, you can say, okay, for this particular instance of my test, for this particular unit test, if the deck class's get 7 objects method is called, not get 7 objects, sorry, if the get 7 cards method of the deck class is called, then return this particular list of 7 cards. So you can actually forcefully say, if it's called, return these 7 cards, and they could be the 2 of clubs and the 7 of diamonds and the whatever. And you can create the sort of response, the returned value, to be whatever it is that you want it to be. That way you can maintain a sort of error-free environment, a guaranteed error-free environment from your dependencies. Okay, so if there is any interaction between the check for 3 of a kind method, which is what you're testing, and the deck object or the deck methods get 7 cards, if there's any sort of interaction, you have mapped it out yourself and you know exactly what is going to happen. There will never be an error. It doesn't matter what you do to the code behind the scenes inside of the deck object. You could completely, screw up the code inside of the, get 7 cards method. Doesn't matter what you do to it. Using the mocking framework, it will always return those 7 cards that you specified. Okay? Or you can go further and say, well, I don't really care what 7 cards it returns, so you can just, sort of make it randomly return 7 cards. Okay? You obviously have to program that in yourself. You'd have to maybe create a deck of cards yourself, shuffle the deck up, and then just, pull 7 off the top of the deck. But the point is that you can strip away the randomness or the not randomness, the complexity of the dependency, and drain it down to something that is completely manageable and bite-sized and does not surprise you in any way, shape, or form, thus opening up the floor for your actual unit test to perform what it is that it needs to do, okay, which is actually test the code inside of the check for 3 of a kind, so that if there are any errors, the errors only exist inside of the method that you're testing and nowhere else, okay? So that's really mocking in a nutshell. Okay, so let me get a little bit more specific now with respect to mocking. You may have heard me talk about JUnit, okay? And JUnit is what I talked about in the last episode, which is what we use to, or at least what I use to create unit tests, okay? So JUnit is one part of the equation, okay? And it's a big part of the equation for creating unit tests. So how do you use mocking? Is mocking inside of JUnit already? Well, I don't believe so. I think you need to go out and you need to grab yourself a mocking framework, okay? The one that I've used before that I know well is Mockito, okay? Mockito, Mockito. And you can easily do a Google search for Mockito, and I guess I might as well do that right now so I can find out what the website is. And it looks like it's part of Google's stuff. I don't know if it's a Google product, but I think it's part of the Google hosting projects and stuff like that. So it's actually part of code.google.com/p/Mockito, all lowercase. And that will take you to sort of the Mockito homepage where you can go and download the jar file, okay? So with Java, it all comes down to a jar file, which is a Java archive file. You can download the jar file and just sort of plug it into, put it into a lib directory or something inside of your code, and then you go into your project and you can add it to your Java class path. Once it's on the class path, you're good to go, okay? So that's beside the point for it. I don't want to get into how you'd actually go about installing it and troubleshooting all that stuff. But Mockito is one of the frameworks that you can use to mock up objects. Now, that's not to say that that's the only framework that you should concern yourself with. There's a whole bunch of other ones. I've used PowerMock before, okay? And PowerMock is useful because there's lots of little nuances inside of mocking objects up, and perhaps that's because it's sort of it's not a front of the line, or what's the word I'm looking for? It's not the most popular thing out there that programmers are using, because I think there's only from what I've noticed, there's a small subset of programmers who actually fully implement unit tests. Which is kind of sad because it really is so useful. I'm a big advocate for unit testing, and it's not. When I was in school, it wasn't taught in school, right? So if you don't learn it in school, then you need to learn it out on the job, and every corporation or whatever is different. So you may or may not have exposure to unit testing, which is why I'm talking about it now. In any case, there are lots of frameworks out there for mocking up objects. These are the popular ones, okay? Mockito is popular. PowerMock is popular. I believe I've heard of JMock as well. So let me tell you a little bit about the ones that I've used before. Mockito I like because it's fairly simple. There's the page that explains how to use it. It's quite straightforward. They just say, if you want to do this, here's the code. If you want to do that, here's the code. And you can learn it very quickly, and you can sort of get a hang of it very quickly. But Mockito does not provide support for a broad range of unit testing scenarios. What I mean by that is this. If you have a class, or rather a method that is marked as final, okay, so we've talked about the final keyword before. When you use the final keyword, you're saying that you don't want this to be messed around with. You don't want people to be able to, override it or subclass it or change it in any way, shape, or form. Okay, so because if someone labels something as final, Mockito is not allowed to actually create a mock for it. Okay, so if you're trying to mock up a method call and it's marked as final, then you're out of luck. So then you need to use something like a more powerful framework like PowerMock. Okay, so PowerMock gives you the freedom of mocking up classes that are actually labeled as final, and as well as static, because static causes problems as well inside of Mockito. Okay, so and I believe even private methods can be handled with the PowerMock framework. Again, Mockito, I don't think it can do anything with private variables or private methods, but I believe PowerMock is able to do it. Now, I would highly suggest that you start with a simpler framework like Mockito, get a hang of it, get used to it, write some code with it, mock up some objects, understand how to use it, and then you can move on to a PowerMock or JMock or some other more powerful framework. But the key is this: if you are dealing with a product that you are developing yourself from the ground up, then you may never hit a situation, or at least you can actively avoid situations where you would need to turn to frameworks like PowerMock. Okay, so if you can actually engineer your code so that it is unit test friendly. Okay, and that is when you can do that right from the get-go, you're just going to save yourself a lot of headaches. Okay, so always keep unit testing in mind when you're starting a project. Even no matter how small the project is, even if it's just a quick assignment for university or something like that, I would still advise you to use unit testing, just because it allows you to make such flexible code. You can create this code and you can really be confident that everything is working as it should be working, because you're testing the behaviors, you're testing the outcomes, and if anything goes out of whack, boom, you get an error and you know immediately that something is not right. So it just gives you this high level of confidence when working with your unit tests. Okay? So, like I said, mocking is all about enhancing your abilities to work with unit tests. Okay, you don't want to frustrate yourself with failures in dependencies on other objects. You just want failures to crop up when you have an actual error inside of the unit that you're testing itself. Okay, so having said that, having talked a little bit about what mocking is, having talked about what it is that mocking can do for you, and what actual frameworks are that you can use, I want to talk a little bit more about tips and tricks that you can use for mocking. Okay, so I'm going to talk. The rest of this talk is going to be around Mockito, which is the sort of first framework that I would suggest that you go out and try for yourself. The rest of the talk will be about Mockito. So, what can you do with Mockito? Well, one thing that's kind of neat is you can use this keyword called verify. Okay, and you can verify certain things that either have or have not happened with your mocked up objects. So, for example, let's say that you're in a situation like sending out an email. I worked on something just this week where I had to create a job that would run once a day, every single day, and it should send an email to a particular person if a certain scenario arises. Okay, so the scenario that arose or that should arise it's kind of like a Craigslist site. So it's like a classified ads type of site, and if someone has posted a listing and the listing is now more than X number of days old, like let's say 30 days old, and it's still sort of active, I should send an email to that user to say, hey, your listing is still active, you haven't taken it down yet, would you like to renew your listing? Okay, so if you want to renew your listing, then you can click the button and then boom, it'll go back to the top of the page, and hopefully you'll get more page views, and hopefully then you'll get more interest in people wanting to buy your whatever it is that you're trying to sell on this classified ad site, etc., etc. So, sending an email was part of this job that I needed to create, this job that would run once a day, every day. I say job, it's kind of like a process, a coding process. So I wanted to obviously create unit tests around this, but I didn't want it to actually send an email, okay? But I wanted to make sure that it did call the method, okay? Because I didn't want my unit test to actually go out and send an email every single time I ran the unit test, because that would really be quite annoying. I noticed that anyway, because when I would run the unit test over and over again, and it would keep sending emails over and over again, and my email inbox would just be filled with all these test emails, and it just gets quite frustrating. So I decided, what am I doing? Let me mock up this object so it doesn't do that anymore. But, like I said, I wanted to verify that the method was actually being invoked. Okay? So you're able to do this with Mockito. You mock up your class, your object, which in this case was a mail service that I would use. I mocked up the mail service, and when I ran the test, which was testing the actual job itself, not the mailing, but the job, which should check and see, which are the eligible users to have an email go out to them. That was the purpose of the job. That would run, and given an exact scenario, so I gave it input to say, okay, here's my scenario. These are the users that I want to have an email go out to. Run the code, but I don't want you to send an email. So I mocked up, like I said, the mail service class, and when the actual system that I was testing, the actual job that I was testing, when it was done running, I would say, okay, I want to verify that the mail service was called, whatever method it was, like send message or something like that. I want to make sure that it was called exactly once, and it was called with this as an input. So you can actually be that specific. You can say, I want to make sure that it was only called once, or you can say called twice, or you can just say called at least once or twice. You could even say, I want to make sure that it wasn't called, okay, because there's certainly scenarios when you don't want certain methods to be called, et cetera, et cetera. Or you can even say it's called at most once or twice, okay? So there's lots of flexibility with your verify sort of commands and what you can do here. And like I said, you can even look at what actually was sent into that method as an input, if it does take any parameters or not. So I can actually say, hey, Mr. Mail service, I want to make sure, one, that you were called, and two, that you were called with these particular users, because I don't want to have a mystery user jump into that input parameter list and be sending emails to someone that I didn't intend on sending emails to. And I obviously want to make sure that the people I did intend messages to go out to are actually inside of that parameter list or whatever it is, okay? So that's really cool. That's really powerful. You can get really specific with what it is that you want to see and what it is that you don't want to see, okay? So that's Mockito for you. Quite useful. Now, here's one more thing that you can do with mocking that to me anyway, is really, really cool. With Mockito, you can do something called spying, okay? And that's different from mocking in one basic way. Spying is essentially you're able to run the mocking methods on a real object, okay? So, again, the whole point of mocking is it creates the stub or a framework, an empty shell of an object. And then you can, use things like verify if certain things were called, or you can say when certain things are called, this is what I want to return, no matter what. So there's no unexpected surprises. But sometimes, in certain cases, you want to actually be able to mock up certain methods inside of a real object. So you actually want to instantiate a real object. But if a certain method is called, then you want to sort of, give a mocked reply. So you want to say, okay, doesn't matter what the code is. If this is called, I just want you to return, whatever. I want you to return the number 100 or something like that. But if I call any other methods, I want you to actually execute the real code that I've written out without, mucking around with it. And more importantly, I want to be able to verify if certain methods were called. Like I said before, you can verify if it was called once, twice, never, at least once, at most once, all that stuff. You can actually do that. You can verify if certain things were done on a real object. Okay? Now, I'm not going to get into how it's actually able to do that, because, again, it's a more advanced topic. But that comes in handy when you're in a situation where the code that was written was originally written without unit testing in mind. So oftentimes when you have this code that's already been written, that's maybe 5, 10, 15 years old, you can still use or create new unit tests and use these creative ways to be able to carry out your unit testing without running into the brick wall of, oh crap, I can't actually write a unit test for this because of XYZ. So the frameworks these days are I think they're getting much better, much smarter, and much easier to work with as this technology sort of develops. Okay, and that's the natural progression of things. Right now, Mockito is the easy one to use, but maybe tomorrow there will be another one released that's just a piece of cake to use, and the functionality that it gives is just, intense or amazing or whatever, off the charts. So that's the way that things go in the technology world and programming. So let's hop on board and get using this stuff and get learning this stuff, because, like I said, it's really cool. It's fun to work with, and it saves you a lot of headaches in the long run. Trust me. Okay, so there we go. That's a little overview on what mocking is, and if you want to learn more about it, like I said, start with Mockito. It's nice. It's easy to use. You can go to that website that I gave you. I'll throw that in the show notes so that you can just click through, and I'll make sure I link up to the actual tutorials itself for Mockito, so you can just quickly get on board and get going with using mocking and make your life a little bit easier, right? So, fantastic. There you go. Let's move on to one last portion of the show, which is questions from the listeners. Not sure why I use that tone, but anyway, I love getting questions from you guys, and I'm really excited to have a really good question come in from one of the listeners who actually emailed me right after I completed recording last week's episode, so they've had to wait a whole week for this. But thank you for your patience, and it is worth it because it is a great question. Now, they say that they have a question not directly related to programming, but they have a day job, which they say they can't leave their day job, but they have free time afterwards, obviously. Typically, that's you have your 9 to 5, and then people have their 5 to 9, which they can allot to things like learning and whatnot. In any case, they want to work towards becoming a professional programmer and work remotely as a freelancer, which is great. Awesome goal. I love it. It's entirely achievable. In any case, they said that they've been reading books and articles, listening to podcasts, and they're able to write some very simple programming, but there's a huge gap in their knowledge between their current experience and knowledge and the programming skills required to apply for even the simplest of freelance jobs. And they say that usually the gap it can be filled when people go for like an internship or a beginner level job to collect the experience, but for them, they already have a full-time job. That's not an option. So they're desperately trying to find some sort of alternative, but so far have come up empty. And they say, well, you're an experienced programmer. Are you aware of any opportunities to bring their skills to a professional level without having to be part of a permanent job? Perhaps some tutoring or mentoring possibilities, someone who can answer questions and work remotely on a team, perhaps, helping with projects, blah, blah, blah. So, and they say the most important thing that they say here is that they're willing to work for free for a year or two to dedicate and commit themselves to get those skills. So, how can they do it? Good question. So, first thing I would say is LinkedIn. LinkedIn is great for networking. Be sure your LinkedIn profile is up to date. make sure all of your relevant experience and whatnot is there, and you're trying to use some flowery language type of stuff to, buff yourself up and make you sound like a rock star. Because by all means, you probably are. Coders these days, if you can make it through to the point where you feel, comfortable enough to start working as an entry-level developer, you're in a good spot, okay? So get your LinkedIn profile up and running and in a polished state, because I constantly get requests from recruiters, okay? So recruiters are your first avenue for landing something. Now, I realize you're particularly not looking for a job right now, but perhaps recruiters might have an idea of some way to get you into a program where you can work for free. Because trust me, companies, if they can get someone to work for them as an intern absolutely at no cost, I'm pretty sure there would be at least one or two companies in the entire world that would be happy to bring you aboard and mentor you, okay? I would almost be willing to guarantee that. So recruiters would be your first step if you don't have a lot of time to invest in reaching out to companies and saying, hey, here's my situation. I'm willing to work for you for free if you provide mentoring services. So get recruiters. That's your best spot to put the least amount of effort to get the most amount of results. So you're making your what's the term? Bang for your buck. That's the one. So that's my first suggestion. Second one is check out meetup.com. Okay, meetup, meetup.com. All right, it's a great website for being able to get in touch with, physically in touch with people in your area who are interested in things that you are interested in. So, for example, just yesterday there was a meetup near where I live in actually Toronto, Ontario, Canada, with a bunch of entrepreneurs who get together. You have a drink, you meet some people, you exchange business cards, that kind of thing. That could also be a great spot for finding someone. I know there's tons of entrepreneurs out there who want to launch a product and they just can't afford a developer. Okay, so if you're saying, well, look, I'm a beginner, but I know a lot about coding, I know a lot about programming, I just need to start, having some real world experience. Would you be willing to bring me aboard? And like I said, just like there's companies who'd be willing to bring you on, I'm sure that they would be very interested in bringing you on board as well as a developer. Now, I realize that you were talking about having someone to mentor for you as well, and that was important, but that will lead me into my third or fourth point, I'm not sure anymore, is just working on your own project, okay, is huge. That's how I gained a whole wealth of knowledge in a framework called Spring that is used with Java. It's used in sort of web technologies, being able to have the front end of a website talk with the back end, the server side, which is the Java side. I learned Spring on my own by creating my own product. Okay, I created a product in an environmental services field where technicians out in the field, they were using pen and paper to take notes in the field. They're doing these things called land surveys or land classification surveys where they would actually write down nice boring information like what the soil is like and what the trees are like, how tall they are, how many leaves the trees had, all this environmental, stuff, whatever. They're doing this all with pen and paper, and it's, it's the 21st century. It's 2013 right now. Coming upon spring, thank Lord. It's nice and it's getting warmer here in Canada. In any case, I'm getting off track. So it's 2013. These people should be using digital technology. They should be using iPads or some sort of ruggedized, is that a word? Technology to take down their notes, not pen and paper, because that's just such a waste of money with turning that pen and paper into digital work later. In any case, I created this software application from scratch using this framework that I was not familiar with at all. And I learned along the way, and that helped me immensely in my professional career. Okay, if it wasn't for that, I honestly think that I would have been a lot worse off. I would have been a lot slower at getting up to speed with these technologies. Because once you get your hands dirty and you hit the problems that you're going to hit in the real world, if you develop your own project on your own, or maybe with another entrepreneur who has an idea for a project, you're going to learn these skills. Okay, it's almost just as good as the real world. So by all means, think up your own project. Start writing out requirements or features for a product that you would like to have. Maybe there's one repetitive task that you have that you do all the time and you wish that there was some sort of solution for it. Whatever the case, just pick it up and go. Start writing the code. Do it yourself. Use Google. Use Stack Overflow. Use how to program with Java. Use everything at your fingertips to learn about coding and how should you handle transactions in a real world. How should you handle creating a website from scratch? What are the things that are involved in that kind of process? Like, these are all things that you should go out and test out for yourself and try out. You'll see what works and what doesn't work. You'll run into really strange errors and you'll want to tear your hair out, and you'll be losing your mind over this one stupid thing that if you just could get this one thing right, then everything would be okay in the world. And you know what I mean? These are the real experiences that you are going to have when you are working on your own project, or like I said, perhaps someone else's project. And it's just going to be such an amazing learning experience. Again, it's nice to have a mentor. I understand that. But it's not, you can get very, very, very far on your own without having a mentor and just using technology these days. Like I said, Stack Overflow. You can post a message and have, literally people reply to your question within minutes of asking it. Okay, I've used it time and time again. If I get stuck and the people there, sometimes they could be a little rude and you have to have sort of a stone look, or whatever the terminology is for dealing with those jerks on the internet. But put up your front and ignore the jerks and just take in what it is that they're saying and try to understand what it is that they're saying when they're giving you information and giving you tips and pushing you in a certain direction. So there you go. That's my advice. Like I said, get on LinkedIn, talk to recruiters, get yourself out there using Meetup. Look for events in your area. Look for programming events. Obviously, that's a great one. You could maybe meet other programmers because maybe they need help with their work and they're willing to mentor you. Or just go to meetups with entrepreneurs who are launching their own product and they need some help at low cost. Or in the last case, create your own project. Start your own thing. Okay, maybe you have a business idea that you say, well, if I could create this, I could probably make some money. Well, then what's stopping you? You don't need someone, standing over your shoulder, giving you a pat on the back to say, it's okay, I'm here if you fail. Screw that. Don't worry about that. Go out there, fail, do it. Because if you fail, you're going to learn so much from it. And that's what failure is all about. You learning something from the experience, right? Then it's not even a failure. Then it's a complete strive forward into a stronger career or a stronger you, right? So there you go. There's my answer. Great question. Thank you very much for sending it in. Again, the name of the person, I didn't want to mention it because they didn't actually explicitly give me permission to say it, so I'll hold back on that. Hopefully the answer is to your liking. If you have any other questions about that, just shoot me the email. Or if anybody else beyond that one person has any questions related to programming at all, I love having these rants where I get to sort of spew out whatever opinions happen to be in my head, and hopefully you guys enjoy listening to it and taking these little nuggets of knowledge and putting them into action, right? That's what it's all about, taking action and making things happen. So until next time, everybody, thank you very, very much for listening. As always, I will leave you with one impression before I let you go, and that impression is that my ebook, the second edition of my ebook, is coming out very, very soon. I've hashed out a lot of the work already. I'm just putting in the last sort of final touches on it. As for an actual release date, I don't have one set yet. But like I said, join my mailing list at howtoprogramwithjava.com. You can actually go to howtoprogramwithjava.com/session22, and you'll see a little pop up for the email list sign up that'll show up at the bottom of the page. You'll see a little Java tips book. Fire your email in there, and I will let you know the second it comes out. And it's going to be cram-packed with lots of cool stuff. There's going to be tests in there. There's going to be assignments in there. There's going to be, I'm actually integrating the audio portions of some podcasts into their videos and even some, like I said, some worksheets and whatnot. Just a lot of cool stuff in the second edition. So, look forward to that. And until next time, everyone, take care of yourselves. Happy learning, and bye for now.
Thanks for listening to the How to Program with Java podcast. Please visit howtoprogramwithjava.com for more useful Java tutorials.